Go for it.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a special day today on Rogue Money, and we have today with us a man that really needs no introduction. If you've been paying attention, or if you've been living under a rock, you need to do some catching up because this guy's a very special guest. Very, very, very good friend of mine. I love him. He's like a brother. He's like a big brother to me. So we always joke around whenever we get a chance. But it's always my pleasure to have W on with us. CJ's in the background, running the lithium crystals and the flux capacitors, making sure that the airwaves are coming out nice, crispy, and clean. So W's got some great intel to share with us, especially with everything that's going on. Russian salad dressing, Russian caviar, Russian hacks, Russian voting this, Russian that. He's going to cover the gambit of it and what the latest moves of the deep state is as it relates to Trump, as it relates to the things that are happening right now in this country and across the world, especially in the Middle East. We're seeing a lot of rising tensions, a lot of moves and counter moves, and a lot of power plays being made on the back end. So these are all things that we need to be mindful of. With that being said, W, welcome back, sir.
How you doing there, bro?
I'm hanging in there, man. You are in an undisclosed location in your decommissioned Cold War submarine somewhere off the coast of the West Coast, dodging the Fukushima radiation. You just finished having a absolutely smorgasbord of a breakfast served to you by a bevy of beautiful women, and now you are here talking with the ape.
Well, and I think she was Russian. Matter of fact, now that I think about it.
There's a Russian connection there.
Uh,
did you have Russian caviar?
no, I'm not a. I'm personally not a big caviar guy. I have it occasionally, fairly rarely, but I'm not a big caviar guy. You got to be in the right mood to have caviar, and you got to have the right kind of drink with it. And
Yeah,
if you're in the right location, the right mood, it's cool. But it's not. It's not my favorite thing. Although I have had some pretty good stuff at times. So it's
sure.
usually the dressings that go on it with the caviar that I like more than the caviar. But,
Absolutely. So what's new, man? What's where do you want to begin?
well, I think
Floor is yours.
let me just tease a little bit here, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. But of course, as you know, I was down in the islands for a period of time over the last couple of weeks, and the Obama family followed me there, and then they and are now down in French Polynesia. Now, why are they in French Polynesia, Tahiti? What's going on? Well, he's going to write his memoirs. He's been contracted to do a book. This one he supposedly will actually write. Uh, and but there may be a little bit more to that than is at first glance, and some people are alluding to that. He's trying to avoid prosecution or arrest here in the United States for uh, wiretapping President Trump,
Really?
and that I don't believe that's going to happen for an instant. But of course, that's what
Right.
uh,
Some people are saying.
some people are saying. I think it was Rick Wiles that said it yesterday, or the day before, and so I think there's a lot of speculation there, and I have no clue if there's something more that it's based on that's tangible. But that's the kind of stuff that's been out there, people speculating on. But we'll come back to that in a few minutes.
Okay.
One of the things that's going on in the background related to wiretapping, Larry Klayman came out last week and made a pretty big stink, sent letters to the congressional committee that's looking into the Russian hacking and wiretapping of Trump and things like that, and wanted uh, the uh, congressman to interview Dennis Montgomery. Dennis
Mhm.
Montgomery is a kind of an interesting figure. Uh, and he has claimed, and Clayman has backed him up as well as others have, that he had um, 600 million pages of documentation of uh, personal information on American citizens, uh, from records retrieval and wiretapping, etc., of private information, bank records, etc., that was obtained illegally by CIA, NSA operation, and that was operating outside of any legal jurisdiction, a la a FISA court type of situation. well, who is this Dennis Montgomery, and could he possibly actually have this stuff? And was he actually a government employee? Uh, I first met Dennis Montgomery
Hmm.
the late 90s. And the context was I'd been down at a Reno air race with friends. And during that race, one of my close friends had a close friend who was involved in a business deal. And the business deal was to colorize old black and white um, film for TV and things like that. And so by colorizing these old black and white movies, the idea and newer TV shows, etc., by doing it cheaply, at that time, the cost to colorize a movie was very high because you had to go literally through frame by frame and and colorize all the various features in that area to make it look halfway modern. And the hope was that using a software program that you could rapidly colorize old black and white TVs and movies. And of course, if you owned black and white TV and movie rights, being able to colorize those and then remonetize them in the current market was a big deal. The reason that I was talked to about it initially was I'd been an early investor in a company down in Mexico that had uh, gotten the rights for broadcasting old black and white TV shows like I Love Lucy and things like that, Andy Griffith and stuff, stuff from the 50s. And then also had got the rights to broadcast, I believe it was NFL or baseball, I can't remember which, or both initially, in Spanish and rebroadcast them in Mexico, live and that sort of thing. And they also got the rights to sell sports memorabilia from the big, sports syndicates down there, and they
Hmm.
continue to expand. So the reason that because I was familiar with this. Uh, Raising the value of black and white stuff by colorizing it potentially in those markets. Uh, my contact, whose a name a lot of your listeners would know, asked me to come back down for a meeting a week or two later
Yeah.
and actually see the technology demonstrated, which I did. And I wasn't that super impressed with it. It was using, to my recollection now, 20 years later, uh, as best as I could understand it and tell. And you and I have talked privately. I had exposure to the early days of video going to the consumer level, and was right there in the midst of it with the video games and things like that with the people who were actually doing it. So I had a familiarity with a lot of the basics. And so in looking at it, they were looking at, literally only determining straight lines versus curved lines, and the length of the lines to decide, is it a table, is it a box, is it a person's face, and looking for certain features that identify a face versus curtains or a chair in a room. And because that was the most difficult thing, was to keep moving with the objects that were moving, not the ones that were still in the background in a film, and keep the skin tones changing correctly for a face.
Hmm.
Um, I wasn't that impressed, but it was interesting. It was cool. Um, but I don't believe that my contact actually became a partner or became involved at all. He's passed away several years ago. And so I don't have him to find out more, but it didn't go anywhere that I was aware of. About 5 years later, um, I was approached again, and it was related to software being proposed to be used in airport security for rapid screening of passengers that were, wanted to be in the database from Faces ID. And the idea was uh, now post 9/11. The earlier meeting was, well before 9/11. In that post 9/11 world, was that passengers that were had their facial pictures in the database for Homeland Security would then be able to bypass all the screening or a significant portion of the screening that slowed people down getting through check-in and be able to go right out to gates, because you have business travelers that travel, a couple times a day sometimes, and so going through the security screening, and it's slow. And in this particular case, it was a major airline that was looking at it to be the first one to use this type of technology because it was affecting their bottom line, and keeping their flights on time, getting out on time, with people missing because they're getting bogged down in security.
Yeah.
And so they were looking at this as a possible way to be the first vendor to use this technology in conjunction with Homeland Security. Ultimately, uh, in the conversations that I had, I just didn't see how it would be safe or could work for that purpose. Um, I was aware that casinos down in Nevada were using it to find minors that had been, screened out as underage, trying to gamble in the casinos, and people that were in the black book for the casinos, etc., or to follow people that may be under suspicion of stuff from one casino to another with their activities groups. And of course, for those that may not be aware of it, that's when you had the MIT guys that were doing the card counting and taking casinos all around the world for big sums
Right.
of. So the Faces ID or facial recognition stuff was pretty important. Um, I, was aware of it for the particular thing that I was, talked to about on it. That didn't materialize either, but I was aware of it. I was aware that this was the same person that I had dealt with years and years earlier.
Hmm.
The next thing that happened, though, was that apparently, as a result of his contacts, Mr. Montgomery, Dennis Montgomery, was able to convince, in this same time period, uh, uh, government agencies that he had the ability to screen out or observe um, uh, hidden messages in these terrorist videos that were coming out of terrorist organizations. And the belief was that they were sending coded messages.
Oh, you're breaking up, W. You're breaking up.
uh, that their terrorist contacts
Uh-huh.
were.
W, you're breaking up.
I'm not moving. I don't know if. Uh, Tell me if it gets better.
Yep, you're good now.
Okay. Um, uh, the idea was that they could pick. Dennis Montgomery said that he could pick out hidden messages in these videos. The messages were being sent supposedly in ways that then the terrorists that were in remote locations all over the world, these hidden cells, could see the hidden messages and then go do specific terrorist acts at specific locations, and they'd know the code. And so, as a result of that, they gave Mr. Montgomery reportedly $30 million.
Yeah.
Contract was much larger than that, but he only actually ended up getting about 30 million before people started questioning what he was able to do, what he claimed that he could do, uh, and what specifically happened. And in this time frame was there was a couple days before Christmas in about 2000, I think 4 or so. Uh, Mr. Montgomery, dealing with his government contacts on this contract, claimed that he'd found a message that indicated that there was a terrorist act going to occur around Christmas, and it's only a couple days before Christmas, and it was going to come out of Paris, and it was going to be a heavy aircraft. And so suddenly they ground the 747s coming from Paris into the U.S. It damages the French uh, airline damages, the tourist industry into France, hurt them very badly because it happened numerous times after that.
Yeah.
And the French did their own investigation along with other intelligence services around the world, trying to find these hidden messages, and they just couldn't find it. And their expert valuation was that the messages, the way they were being claimed by our intelligence services to be able to be encoded and decoded, there just wasn't enough information in the pictures to send digital information spectrum, if you will, to send the kinds of messages and the kind of detail um, that was being claimed by Miss Montgomery. And so they decided that these foreign agencies decided it was fraudulent, and domestic people that were experts in these types of things also determined that what he was saying just couldn't be true, was the determination. Um, whether that's ever been overturned or not, I'm not aware of, but there have been lawsuits and things like that. Montgomery's been called a fraud and a hoax
Yeah.
based on that specific thing. However, Mr. Montgomery, Dennis Montgomery's saga continues. And I'm going through this long explanation because there's a lot of stories out there. I'm trying to give you enough background so people can then weigh what I'm about to say in a minute. Uh, in about 2006 or so, Mr. Montgomery was approached by the intelligence agencies, or he approached them, about being able to get past um, firmware and hardware
Hmm.
in security systems. And that firmware or hardware was believed to be safe from cyber attacks, from hacking outside the system. In other words, you would have to be physically in the room or have physical access in order to get past these firmware or hardware firewalls to
Okay.
be able to hack the system and get data out of the system. So he claimed to have a way to remotely get into these systems, bypass these firmware firewalls and hardware firewalls, and read data, um, or plant data or remove data. And uh, they apparently came to some type of agreement, came number of how much it would cost to be able to do this hacking. And it was a very high number, in the tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars. Uh, whether that much was actually spent at the end of the day, I don't think anybody knows that for certain. It may have only been a few million that was spent, but Mr. Montgomery went to a military installation on the
Yeah.
East Coast, was given access to this installation that was used as a cyber spying location by CIA, and began to put his system together. He was asked on a couple of occasions to go find specific records in computer systems of banks and other locations. And so each time he would bypass the firewall, get in, do what he did, and get back out was very risky. They were afraid that, they'd be detected and then it would cause a problem
Right.
within the. But what happened was pretty quickly on, they realized that rather than go in and in these computer systems for these banks and other locations, if they just had a wide enough window, he could download, just like the banks were basis overnight, clearing their systems, go in and download everything in the bank's system and just keep the record. And then if you wanted to go find something, you'd have a record at least from that slice in time. And so he started periodically, as they needed it, going into the large banks and other institutions and pulling everything out. He'd have an hour or two opportunity, and supposedly was able to get all that data out, which would work if you have the right computers and the way stuff is stored and transmitted. So I should say updated. And that was similar to what was being done with backdoors into the Promise via the Promise software in the 80s and 90s, and even up to current variations of it. But his methodology was unique. um, stuff that affects the election.
Hmm.
So in the course of that, a question came to him apparently sometime in early 2008. Could he get into the Florida voter database? And remember, he's actually got real money, real access. He's at a secure facility. He's a private citizen contractor. He is not a government employee, but he has access to really big toys and expensive equipment. He's not being treated as a fraud, even though there was an earlier allegation of fraud, that he had fraudulently portrayed his abilities to see these images in the videos that were secret coded messages to Taliban and damaged a whole nation state with France and other locations. But apparently redeemed himself somehow, convinced these people that he was real.
Yeah.
Nations going into the bank stuff could be, but he passed the tests. So now they ask him if he can go into the Florida database. He does. Then they come back and say, well, can you download the whole Florida voter database for us? And amazingly enough, within a few days, he's able to do that digitally. They take that data, the control agents that were handling and managing him, which were allegedly CIA. And you have to picture, just stop for 1 second and understand. Our NSA capability, National Security Agency,
Hmm.
our CIA capabilities for mining data are off the charts. So why is Mr. Montgomery, with actually just a few tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment and a location, why is he being tasked to go into these databases and get this information out? Because remember, within the legitimate NSA and CIA operations, we have back doors that are
Sure.
built into all the computer programs. That is the promise software. And it allows us to go in and look real time at anything we want to, if it's covered by a FISA court warrant, which is the court, the secret court that authorizes, based on a request, a legal request to, with a warrant, to do surveillance on an American citizen, um, uh, for national security purposes. We have legitimate tools to do
Yeah.
that, and mechanisms for doing that. So why is this guy, Dennis Montgomery, being asked to do what amounts to a duplicate job with what also amounts to be sticks and stones, as
Hmm.
opposed to fine precision instruments that are specifically set up with legal back doors written into all the software? We can sneak you and look at real time, because when you do it in those legal routes, you create a history, you involve lots of people, there's records, and they're discoverable. Mr. Montgomery is working parallel and outside of the legal realm, doing what he's doing domestically from a U.S. government property secured by U.S. government personnel as a private citizen, hacking into private databases, looking at U.S. citizens and data. So from that location, allegedly, he gets into the Florida voter roll data banks,
Yeah.
downloads everything, gives it to his control officers. They come back a few days later and ask him to reload it up with a different voter roll database that they have
Hmm.
altered somehow. And he does so and plants it. Now, the reason that's relevant is because if you added voters, if you changed things in certain ways, changed how votes are counted in different districts, etc., you could affect the outcome of the election. And that's the assertion by Larry Klayman and Mr. Montgomery, that the first time that Obama was elected, part of the reason he was able to be elected was because the voter rolls were manipulated,
Oh.
and that data was manipulated in Florida,
Hmm.
and that was part of Dennis Montgomery's operation. Uh,
Interesting.
is it true or not? Well, he has a lot of data, and they have Clayman and Montgomery and other people that are aware of it have been made aware of the data. He has a whistleblower lawsuit going, and as a whistleblower to be out, come out and give his evidence. And what's happened to Mr. Montgomery? The reason why he supposedly came out and started saying what he was saying is somewhere after these events, uh, approximately 2010, I believe, but I'm not positive on the exact time. He was diagnosed with uh, brain problems, aneurysm, other things that threatened his life, and thought he wasn't going to last very much longer. And so decided to come clean and make his peace with God and say what he had to say. There may be other reasons, because he was under duress, thinking that with what he'd done and knew that he'd become a liability and didn't want to be
Sure.
off. And if you recall, in this same era, there was the playing around going on with the data related to Obama's passport that
Right.
Brennan involved in. And so that many people believe is the reason that Brennan got his job over at CIA, because he successfully got that passport information switched around. The security guard for the facility, who was, potentially a witness, suddenly he dies, right before he's going to be able to testify about things he may have had knowledge of regarding access to the birth certificates, etc. And I should say passports, supposedly Hillary's and other candidates' files were also looked at, but that was just
Hmm.
covered for looking at Obama's and altering Obama's data in his passport information. So with that in mind, of course, it's quite likely that Montgomery had other concerns beyond his medical problems. But whistleblower status eventually, and has all of this claims. He has the hard, the actual um, possession under Congress. He FBI. He's turned over records to the FBI, and yet uh, nothing substantial. Now here we have the hearings, and what does Clayman come out and say? He says, Trump was wiretapped, Trump was surveilled, related to Trump were accessed and used by members in the Obama administration. And so they want that heard at these hearings. And thus far, that hasn't occurred. Now, the media, if you want to say it that way,
Yeah.
mainstream, has been relying on the fact that there is this court record and these experts who did, in fact, determine that Ms. Montgomery was, at least specifically regarding being able to see hidden messages in these terrorist videos. They can't get away from that he was still recontracted after that for this computer system, which is called the Hammer.
Yeah, the hammer. Okay. Oh, you're breaking up again. You're breaking up. You left off with the hammer.
And sorry about that. But that he would be well and continue to do this work adds a lot of legitimacy to his claims that his data that he has now is real and legitimate, and it's data obtained in such a way, for example, because it's so voluminous. At one point, Sheriff Arpaio down in had determined that he also had been at records of Maricopa County with and case thousands, etc. And so got to help locate those records.
Okay.
And as I understand it, they went in actually had to rent services on a Lockheed computer just to go through the files, because the files are so large that if you used consumer level stuff or regular corporation computers, you'd be there for
Yeah, you're breaking up bad, W.
just searching one name. All right.
All right, go ahead. You sound good now.
Okay. And I apologize. I do have a little bit of a cold. Too many scotches and beers over the last week or two. But as a result of all of this, while there is, I think, a legitimate case to be made that he was fraudulent on this earlier stuff, the fact that he has these records and those records have essentially electronic information encoded in them that identify where and how he obtained that data, what times he attained it. There's all sorts of routing information in there, etc., that would back up his claims. Just dismissing him concerning what he claims to have done, looking into these voter rolls and possibly changing the voter roll information, and subsequently the claims that records of people like Trump and people associated with Trump were tracked, I think it's wrong. You can't dismiss it that easily. And remember, Trump was the one who really forced the issue of the birth certificate prior to the second election in 2012 of Obama.
Yeah.
Long before that, Trump was, well, and had been very vocal about it. Where's the birth certificate? And when Obama came out with the birth certificate there in the White House press conference, Trump did what he believed was the honorable thing and stopped, accepted that, and shut up. Now, certainly, we've had the controversy since then concerning whether or not that document was real. The governor of Hawaii said he couldn't find it just, months earlier, who was supposedly a friend of Obama and grew up with him, and a lot of that's questionable with his claims. But suddenly, after people said there was no paper certificate, they show up with one. I personally am fairly convinced that a lot of the claims as to how the birth certificate is fraudulent, at least the ones that are most people are hanging their hat on, may not be as fraudulent as people say. Doesn't mean that it's an accurate certificate. It just means that the way that they're looking at it doesn't actually quite add up right. And just had that conversation a few weeks ago with somebody that's another expert and says, actually, a lot of these claims just don't work. And we went through the minutia for reasons that will be apparent to some of your listeners in the next few weeks. So with all of this background, part of the question that remains ahead of us is what's going to happen with this deep state and the attack on Trump? Is Trump going to be able to prove that he in fact was hacked, surveilled, wiretapped, and did it have a potential effect on the election? Was that activity lawful and legal? Certainly in this most recent period with the election where Trump was claiming to be hacked in the 2016 election, remember that Mr. Montgomery wasn't doing anything at that time. His claims go back much earlier to 2008 period and before that. So to say that Mr. Montgomery has any new information concerning the most recent election is probably wrong. But it does show that there was this pattern in place. And after Mr. Montgomery stopped doing the work he was doing, was that computer system that he had put together, that methodology for cracking into these databases, from a shadow government location, an off the books location that was not a rightful legal location for this type of surveillance, operated legally within the framework of CIA or NSA, was that still operating and still doing that same work? And those are the questions that really need to be answered by Congress right now. And I think the assertion is that no, they never stopped. Just because Montgomery bowed out and left doesn't mean that that work stopped or wasn't transferred to another location. So certainly there should be investigation into that. The other point, though, and I think it's an important point, and this is where I think the rest of the conversation has to go for your listeners, for the whole country, really. If there was mischief in the 2008 election, and if that mischief altered the outcome, was this president legitimately in office the first time around? Then, secondly, if there was mischief related to the birth certificate and to creating that document or getting it in play, and you can prove it, then imagine this. What if Obama hadn't been able to present a birth certificate at that White House press conference that neutralized what Mr. Trump was saying and stopped at least Trump from participating in the birther movement? Would that movement have continued to grow? Remember, we had signs on the side of the road, where's the birth certificate?
Sure.
There was a real momentum building. And
Right.
if he hadn't provided that birth certificate, would Trump possibly have run in the 2012 election? And we'd have got a Trump presidency 4 years sooner than we now have it. Would somebody else have won if Obama hadn't provided that birth certificate? And what allowed him to provide that birth certificate? This is the conversation that's going to be coming shortly. That birth certificate came into play.
Mm-hmm.
Loretta Fuddy,
AKA Mrs. Obama.
in a very unusual situation. The prior person
Oh, your audio is getting scrambled bad.
Wow, they're really messing with it now.
Yeah, Dub, your audio is getting really screwed up, man.
They're scrambling it.
we will just be very patient, and we will start over. You can cut that clip out there. We'll start right over until they let us have our conversation.
We're live. So, there's no cutting it clips. We're live.
All right.
So what you do is just wait a second. It's okay. It's okay. Well, we'll give it a second. When you have voiceovers like that, it's more than just scrambling. They're screwing with it. So let's try that again. W, you're talking about Loretta Fuddy.
So when Loretta Fuddy, when she became director of the health department in Hawaii, just prior to that, literally almost the same day, if not the same day, the then current director of public health in this news conference suddenly announces that he's resigning, stepping down. And in the course of the news conference, one of the reporters present asks him, well, why are you resigning? And he literally says, I don't know why I'm resigning. The allegation has been, and I don't know that it's ever been actually was that he was threatened behind the scenes because he had health clinics and they did billings for Medicare, Medicaid, things like that, and that somehow the billings were they were overcharging the government, and so he was going to be investigated, and so he had to step down because of these the possibility that he had committed fraud.
Yeah.
Well, he stepped down as the health director, and then but from nowhere, Loretta Fuddy is suddenly appointed. This is a person who was a staff member of Sabud, which was this pseudo-religious organization that
Obama has ties to.
Well, and his mother and in Indonesia. What Sabud is that the Indonesian president in the mid-60s said that Sabud was a CIA country under the cover of Sabud who undermined his presidency. He had Sukarno. I always get.
Are you getting cut bad, bro?
He claimed that power with Sabud was a subversive CIA front operation to presidency or remove him. Remember, mother went to Indonesia. It was one of the hottest spots politically on the planet, and she was there for USAID. It was in the mid and late 60s. You got all of Southeast Asia in flames. You got Vietnam going on, and we learned later at the church committee hearings where all this information came out about the CIA's activity, out that they tried to, get powder products that Castro used to make his beard fall out, and exploding, clamshells or oysters on the beach, sorts of things. The then director of the CIA at one point said that Turk and Chile and places like that.
You're clipping again, man. You're clipping pretty bad. Hey, CJ, why don't we try to tell him to hang up and link back in? See if that would work.
Yeah, that might work if he wants to try to reconnect.
Hey, W, try to reconnect.
Let's see if it clears your connection. Yeah, let's see if that. So V, very eye-opening discussion in terms of what W was sharing with us, and if we remember correctly, back at that point when multiple news agencies, not only InfoWars, but they finally started leading into the conversation that this certificate that was produced by the Obama administration, it was starting to blow the lid off of it, that there was layers, that there was in fact a PDF document. And if you use a simple PDF program, you could see that there were layer on top of layer of this document. And this was starting to really get a heated discussion. And I remember specifically the weekend leading into it. What did they give us, V? Do you remember what they gave us to really change the narrative when this was getting really the lid was getting blown off this fake birth certificate? Do you remember what they did?
Oh, they had Barry come out and unveil his birth certificate, kind of distract everybody.
And once that came out and they said, listen, this is a fake fabricated document, and this was getting carried by everyone, the weekend that this was really starting to heat up and get even louder, they gave us Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, that's right.
To
that's
change
right.
the narrative.
Yep,
Remember, they had that SEAL team mission that Osama bin Laden had been captured, and it completely wiped out the narrative. I mean, that whole fake thing was forgotten overnight when that happened.
I remember very well.
You guys will remember, and your listeners should pay very close attention to this. The members of that SEAL team, large portion of them, were put on a school bus helicopter that was not the normal SEAL team helicopter, and flown through a known terrorist threat location at slow speed, low altitude, and blown to smithereens, extortion 17. And that those guys, which that was the largest death by numbers of any SEAL team operation, I believe, in history to even now.
Yes.
And very serious situation, because why? Because those guys could have told what really did and did not take place that night regarding
bin Laden. Yeah.
Osama.
I'm sure they probably went in there on faulty intel as usual, thinking they were going to grab somebody. And I think it wasn't until later they found out that, hey, that what this was supposed to be Bin Laden, what, and it didn't fit the narrative. And yeah, they whacked him. The whole team got into a CH-47 Chinook, an old piece of junk one, not the typical one that's outfitted for the SEALs, but a cheap cargo one. I mean, what a setup, man! What a setup.
Well, and Mr. Strange, one of the fathers of one of the SEAL team members, has been very vocal, and the Strange Foundation has been pursuing some of this stuff, uh, but they've been forgotten. That
Right.
shouldn't be forgotten. It's a critical piece in this whole history, in this period, because what was that about then? Let's just for a moment consider that if the Bin Laden raid wasn't as advertised, and it was about further doing a magic act to distract the attention of the world, and especially the American citizens, from the birth certificate issue or the legitimacy of Obama to be president. Part of my concern here is that people get so locked into the birth certificate as though it's the single answer as to whether or not Obama was legally able to be in the presidency. But there's lots of other pieces of information out there that bring into question whether or not he had a legitimate constitutional right to be president. At the end of the day, again, if the voter base was adjusted even once, you got to question, was it done other places, other ways, subsequent to that. But let's come back to the specific situation in Hawaii. In Hawaii, when Loretta Fuddy got into the office as director of public health, she then miraculously, where the governor of Hawaii couldn't find the paper certificate, is able to produce a certificate and find whatever documentation they needed and provide it to the attorneys for Obama, who then fly it all the way to the White House and allow President Obama to do his news conference. Fine, that's an investigation. Let people argue over it what they will. But then there were lawsuits. Doug Vogt up in Seattle was doing a lawsuit that probably at the end of the day, many people think wouldn't have gotten through the court system, but we don't know. We never will know. He was going after, in part, Loretta Fuddy on her methodology, some money she had in accounts that he felt may have been payoff money. Other people were looking at it. They're pursuing her legally. In that frame, after the 2012 election, the following year in December, what happens? She's out at Molokai at this leper colony where she has to do an annual inspection, one of the most isolated places on planet Earth. Literally almost a prison, virtually nobody there, only a handful of people still residing there, more controlled than most military bases, even the most secret ones. And when she's leaving on a plane with other passengers, the plane has a very unusual event, a mechanical failure, total engine failure, and does a soft landing in the ocean, allegedly a half-mile out in the open sea in horrible waves, and everybody barely gets out with their life except for her. The reality is that is nothing of what happened. And just as Mr. Montgomery has claimed that military and intelligence assets were used to provide a location and cover for his nefarious activities off the books for the shadow government, because it certainly wasn't legal. If it was legal, it would have been done through a FISA court and through the regular intelligence agencies. It is very apparent that military assets were in play on the day that that plane crashed in exactly that area that had been pre-scheduled to be there.
Yeah.
And once again, including a U.S. Navy submarine set up to run SEAL divers off of a special diver vehicle attachment on that submarine to be at that exact location at the time period that that plane went down.
Wow.
And all sorts of other
Wow.
interesting, for example, the airspace had been pre-cleared days before at 20 to 20 or 23 to 27,000 feet, 24 to 27,000 feet, excuse me, directly overhead that location for a military operation. There's all sorts of fun things that will be coming out over the next many weeks related to that. And the reality is, everything you've heard about that crash and what happened is not what happened.
Wow.
And you're need to pay attention and stay tuned, because again, think about this for a minute. If Loretta Fuddy didn't actually die in that plane crash, or if she did, but it was a staged event, then it was staged to protect only one person on planet Earth, primarily.
Barry. Barack
And
Obama.
remember this, the presidency isn't just one person.
Right.
The presidency is a full team. The reality is, for that team to stay in power, that president, that guy at the point that makes it possible for them all to be there, has to be there. What things were in play in that period? Benghazi, Syria.
Sure.
When Benghazi happened, what was really going on in Benghazi? What was really going on in Libya? There was an arms, gun-running operation, moving guns and munitions, as well as training facilities in Libya where fighters were being trained. And where were they being sent? They were being sent to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, surrounding Syria. And they were getting ready to carry the Arab Spring from North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, that whole region, to then move that north across the Mediterranean and continue that movement and the momentum to take out Syria, to fractionalize Syria. Had Barry not gotten elected in 2012, that whole operation would have been under threat, because that was the game plan. Remember, the very first foreign meeting or a trip that Obama did that set the tone for his whole entire administration was going to Egypt and then saying that not only are we fundamentally going to change America, we're going to reshape the Mideast. And that's exactly what that gun running operation and those fighters and soldiers or terrorists, if you will, being sent north to go encircle Syria was all about. And when that was exposed at Benghazi, when that became exposed, it threw a monkey wrench in those operations. And of course, 6 times there was false flag events. The first one being a supposed mortar that was fired over the border into Turkey and killed a mother and daughter, and by the Syrian government forces. And so the intent was, we need to have an air cap over a border area 10 miles into Syria, and then later it would be expanded. That was what happened in Libya. As soon as you had the air cap, it was over with. And in that moment when they were trying to convince our allies and Congress that we needed to have U.S. military aircraft patrolling this border region to Turkey with this air cap, the Russians brought in their surface-to-air missiles, the 300s and 400s, into Latakia. And by the end of the weekend, an air cap wasn't an option, and Putin made that very clear. But then there was the chemical weapons. There was the claims that weapons of mass destruction were being used against the population that were later proven to be these foreign fighters brought in by Western operations to take out Assad. And so the reality is, who was the beneficiary there? In part, the beneficiary was going to be Saudi Arabia. Why?
Sure.
Because Saudi Arabia wants their oil and gas to be the oil and gas that goes to Europe in the next decades and century, really. And so this is really about who gets this customer base, who's going to own this customer base of Europe out into the future. Is it going to be Russia, Ukraine, or down through the Georgia region and up through Turkey? Or is it going to be Saudi Arabia and Qatar, even Israel, coming up from the south through Turkey, tying into those pipelines going into Western Europe? Who gets that customer base out into the future? And that's what this whole fight has been about. By breaking up Syria, fractionalizing it, you also, the Israelis, rather than have a huge nation state like Syria to contend with, now you have much smaller groups, Hezbollah and a dismantled Syrian government, and then other groups in the north, where they contentious with each other, and Israel can deal with them as much smaller groups, and supposedly have a much safer border region. So Syria was critical, but all of that nefarious activity to reshape the Mideast would have stopped, most likely, or been greatly impeded if Obama hadn't been president. Well, with the assets that were in play at the time that Loretta Fuddy died,
Yeah.
if it wasn't being done above board, and yet you have U.S. military assets in play, whole submarine, multi-billion-dollar submarines, who runs those operations? Who directs SEAL missions and that specific submarine, for example, on SEAL missions? Who has operational control over it? CIA.
Right.
They have the submarine, but when they go certain places or do whatever, and those SEALs are on it, who's actually calling the shots and calling the mission? And so the question is, if Brennan was involved, and if Brennan is tight with the Saudis, is there a CIA angle to Loretta Fuddy's death and to the cover-up to get her out? Because remember, she'd already mission accomplished. She'd had the birth certificate out there. It's later. The president's been elected. All she is now is a liability. So, you want to stage a fake accident and stage a fake death to take her off the books, to take her out of having to testify in any court hearings or further examination. What better place to do it than a place where nobody can be there to watch, totally isolated?
Yeah.
And all the claims about the crash over and over and over, they're false, provably false. And here's the one thing that every one of your listeners should pay attention to. Unlike what Montgomery has, unlike what some of these other whistleblowers have tried to come out with, or the wiretapping claims, etc., which, it's like you got to have a voltage tester to find the electricity. Is the circuit hot or cold? You got to have a programmer that can look at the data and tell you what the data actually means in the computer. The one difference between all of these other assertions of nefarious activity related to President Obama, it's difficult for listeners around the world to grasp, people observing this to get their minds around. They don't have any pictures.
Yeah.
There's nothing to confirm easily to a relatively non-expert.